Hi, Jarrell. How are you? We'll start in a minute. Did you have a good spring break? Good. Glad to hear you're doing well. Yeah, it was nice to have a little break. Okay, so we have, oh, it was good. I went to La Jolla for a couple of days, hang at the beach, nice and breezy, and then I went to the vineyard in Temecula for a couple of days. I like the break. Not ready to go back to work yet, but yeah. Well, Michelle, how are you doing? Okay. So let's get started. It's 5 p.m. Maybe more people will join us. So today we are going to talk about exploit and vulnerability scanner. I had posted the notes and the assignment in your course room on Canvas. So if you want to download the notes and the assignment, we can go through that together. And then for the lab this week, we are going to use the nessrest and also OpenVAS. Okay, so let's share screen. Okay, so you will find the notes here and also the assignment here, and then I'll add the lab tomorrow. So that way we can handle that this week. Next week we'll do the quiz. Gonna be a little light this week coming back. I'll have the video ready tonight in case you need to watch it again. So as we were saying, in this week, we are going to go over vulnerability assessment and also looking at exploit. So the beginning of the chapter, it really touches on what is vulnerability and what kind of exploit that we can identify. So as you have learned in CIS27 or another class, you learn that vulnerability is just a weakness in the system. And in some case, that could be application or user or and so on, right? And that weakness can be taken advantage of by the external entity. Could be an attacker to take advantage or modify your application behavior. So to really track vulnerability, we can use Mitre. Mitre is an organization that manages all common vulnerability and exposures, which is known as SVEs. So the software company like Microsoft, they also have their own, but things like from even browser application from Google or other form of applications, Oracle, etc., that needs to be submitted to the CVE database from Mitre. So if you visit this site, you will find that this would contain a list of CVEs. And then you can search by keyword or the ID here. So when you do the assessment, for example, using Nessus or OpenVAS, you would find that it will provide you with the CVE ID. Then you would take that CVE ID and be able to search for that here, where you can find the details. I know OpenVAS, which is one of the tools that we're going to talk about later, you would see that OpenVAS has the specific information about that particular CVE. Okay, so in the text and also your notes, it talks about how you would be able to identify your CVE. And the way that they track this is you are going to look at the CVE and then it would use a number and that will be the year number, like 2021, 2022, and so on. So it depends on when that CVE is documented. That will be the tracking number, which is tied to its ID. Another way that you can also find vulnerability is through our NIST, which is a government database. Hold on, let me get this open for you. And so if you visit the site, you would find some of the more recent vulnerability that would be listed here. So if you look at the ID, right, see you would have the year, and then it also has the unique number to be able to find it. So now the ranking and the severity, it really depends on the score of the vulnerability. And Mitre comes up with a scoring system where you would be able to identify. So how critical is the vulnerability is based on its score. So in this one, it will be 7.5, and that will be classified as a medium criticality or severity. So the first part of this really defines what vulnerability is, and it also goes into the basic attack information. And from the standpoint of Python, right, one can write the script to remotely attack another system where that system will be a target. And we spent a little bit of time looking at brute force and various things in the last few weeks before the spring break. Or it could be a local attack where it would be on that local system, where they would directly access that local system and perform the attack. Now, the scanners cannot test all vulnerabilities. It can only give you the ones that it would have the definition for based on the library information. So sometimes you would run into some false positive results where that means that it would be able to track things that might not be vulnerable. And then other times it would easily ignore the vulnerability that exists. So exploits are software or scripts that are used to take advantage of the vulnerability or error or failure. And there are a lot of different types of exploit kits that are available. And sometimes you would see that these scripts or software are written in common languages, Java, Python, and so on. So depending on the exploit, now, if we're looking at the 0-day exploit, that means that right off the bat, it's a known vulnerability. So it takes advantage of vulnerability that might not be publicly announced or monitored, and be able to launch an attack as soon as the software is released. So we're looking at Windows operating system. That could be the first time that they release a certain version, and the exploit would take advantage of the OS weakness. Could be services or protocols that's used by certain services. So you would see some 0-day exploits there. Now, the example that the book uses is the OpenSSL CVE, and I put the link there. So in common vulnerability, our job as a pen tester is to really assess existing vulnerability by using these scanners and be able to identify them and put them into the report, possibly derive solutions to be able to read the risk of that vulnerability being heavily impacting our operational system. So we saw that vulnerability are scored based on a scale. So the common vulnerability scoring system was derived to really rank how critical is that vulnerability. So if it's ranking with the higher score range, between 8.0 to 10.0, 10 as the maximum, you would consider that as a high or highly impacted or critical vulnerability. So that will be in the high level. Now for the medium, as you saw the example we looked at earlier, that was 7.5. So that would fall under the medium range. So based on that score, and that would be how critical that is. So as a security professional, you want to address things that are highly impacted or highly critical first, and then you go down the list. So you would have a list of vulnerability and be able to rank them. And then the low impacted vulnerability, that would be between 0.0 to 3.9, and that would be addressed after we address the high and the medium level vulnerability. So in your assignment to start, we can answer the question, the 0-day exploit, what it is and how it can be located. So 0-day exploits are unknown vulnerability in existence. That means that it could also be undocumented, right? But it can be used to launch attacks. And the way that we can identify potential exploit is to look at database, like our national database, or go to common vulnerability and exposure listing on specific vendor or Mitre. We can go there for the main repository of all the CVEs. And then we can take a look at the criticality level by looking at the common vulnerability score system on how it's scored based on the range to really obtain information about the potential exploit. Now, in vulnerability scanner like OpenVAS, it gives you a list of found vulnerability. And what will happen is if you click on the vulnerability, it would give you the information about that vulnerability, and you would have to find ways to be able to mitigate that risk or reduce it. So if we use the example, if you visit this here, which takes you to specific vulnerability, and this was discovered in 2020 or documented in 2020. And this has to do with OpenVPN, that particular version of OpenVPN on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. And because SSL or OpenSSL has known vulnerability, it is a component that's impacting this particular client application. So when we look at this, we can say that they are using CVSS version 3X, which is the newer version of the scoring system. And this scoring system is really spanning for national or even global use for the ranking. So the base score tells you that it is 9.8, which is highly critical. Okay. And so if you go down further, you would find advisory information. So, and with that, the vendor put in bulletin information, so they need to be informing their customer or their users on this vulnerability. So often you would see that companies would notify that through bulletin or some form of notification, newsletter, and so on. So here you would have bulletin. So similar to Microsoft, you would see that. So a lot of software company would release their vulnerability through bulletin. And then in the article, it might tell you information on how or what it is and how we can possibly come up with a solution for it. So the weakness is that it tells you here that it is through enumeration, and enumeration has to do with user input. So input validation is gonna need to be controlled. So in a software that uses this, so let's say that you implement an API that uses Aviatrix OpenVPN, then we have to consider our application on how we build it to make sure that we have proper input validation mechanism in the application. Okay, so these things ties back to your web application or native application that you're using with your company. So it's important that we look at, you know, what is highly impacted, whether it's highly impacted, and how we need to really correct it. And then if you go down a little bit further, right, they have updated this information. So this is what you often see when you go to a database, and the source, as you can see here, that comes from Mitra, even though it's published on NIST. So if you want information on a specific CVE, you would start with Mitra. Okay. All right. So with that said, we can answer number 2. When you visit that site, you would find a base score for that vulnerability, which is 9.8. And so the software tool that you're using, for example, like Nessus or OpenVAS, it uses the database information. And through that, we would have a library of signature for a certain vulnerability. So when you are using Nessus, for example, first it's going to do is it's going to discover all the hosts or a specific host that you tell it to do. So if I just do a general scan or a basic scan, it's going to identify all the hosts that's connected to your network or your local area network. Once it identifies those hosts, it's going to scan against those hosts. So it would do a range scan, and it's based on that scan, it's going to find the vulnerability based on the signature that contains in the actual application. So from there, what it's going to do is going to tell you how often it would find those vulnerability in all your systems or a certain system that you set. And based on the score, we would need to create or use the report to find information that we would need to reduce or remove that vulnerability. Okay. So for that example, we can say that it is highly critical, so we would need to address it first. So when you see the score ranking higher between 8 to 10, that needs to be addressed first. Any question? Okay, so now to expand more before we go into Nessus, right? You would see that for vulnerability, you have the base group, which is your qualities of vulnerability on how that would be based on independent of time and the environment. The temporal group, that will be how it would change over time, because sometimes that can be expanded a little bit more where the vulnerability will become more severe. So it might start out with low, right, with frequent use, or how it would be used where it would be higher in ranking. Okay. So as they update that, we would see that the transition for the vulnerability can go from low to high over time. Then you have the environment group, where a certain vulnerability would have characteristic that would relate to the user environment, like the one we looked at, right? It would relate to user input because, it's a way that how SSL is used. So if input validation is not implemented, then it becomes a bigger problem. So when you look at the scoring system, version 3 is really aimed to address the scope for the global. It's a way that we develop a matrix or a scaling system that would depend on privileges and resources on how that vulnerability would impact the system. And when you assess web applications, you would often refer back to some of the development area that would relate to vulnerability, because all your web applications use some form of services, and the services use protocol that would have inherent vulnerability. And it doesn't necessarily be completely exactly like the vulnerability of the protocol itself, but there would be components of it where it would be either higher or lower in the criticality. So here it talks about how there would be specific characteristics for the group for the vulnerability. Now, one of the primary vulnerability scanner that the industry use is Nessus, which is made by Tenable. The actual licensing for Nessus for the professional use is very pricey. It's above $1,000. Now, the free version, you can use the free version, which is less in scale. That means that it doesn't have as thorough details and bells and whistle, but it will do its job in assessing the vulnerability. So this is a proprietary software, and we can use the free version of the proprietary software. So if you visit the site, you would find Nessus information. Okay, they also produce other tools. So here you can click on Nessus and it will take you to the page. In order to use the free version, you have to register for an account to be able to get the activation code. So after we download and install, we would need to click here and then put in the registration information. And through the email, they will send you the activation code. And using that code, you would then be able to use your Nessus application. Now, running Nessus, depending on your connection and your system performance, but generally, because if you run a basic scan, it is discovering all the hosts around it. So it's similar to other assessment tools, it's going to ping. And so if you have lots of hosts on your network, it's going to take a while. Okay, so you got to give it time in order to really discover the host. Once it discovers the host, it's going to scan against the host to look for the services or the plugins that that host is capable of. And through that, it can identify whether a certain host would have certain vulnerability that exists. So for example, if I have a network that has 50 Windows system and I have some Mac OS or some iMacs, and then I would have some Linux system, it would then discover all those targets and then we'll be able to individually identify the vulnerability and give you the list. So on your notes, it talks about Nessus, what it is, and where to be able to download it. So when you download, you just need to make sure that you select the appropriate operating system that you're running that application on. You would need to obtain an activation key by registering an account. Then you would go through the installation process. And so in general, the graphical user interface walk you through how to install. And then after that, you need to start the Nessus server. So if I'm using my Windows system, what I can do is I can use that local host to make it a server. And all the scans can be done on that server. Okay. So in Ubuntu, you would need to use the browser, go here to download, or to be in Linux like Kali. Once you select the appropriate version, you can download, register for an account, install, and activate that application. Then in Ubuntu, you can start Nessus by doing a start command with Nessus USD. Now, to really see or interface with the application, you have to use the localhost or the loopback address or that system IP address. And by default, you would use port 8834 for Nessus. Okay. So out of the box, we would scan it with the default port number, which is separated with a colon here. So using your browser, you simply put in the IP address or localhost here, and then the port number. And that port is specifically used by default by Nessus. And through the browser, you would have what they call a web interface, and you can set up your report system or run the scan. Okay, so let me take a look. Let me see if there's a... Have you tried the Win32 Msi here? So make sure we download, make sure you would download the right version. Okay. Download on my, okay. Yeah, so this is the 64. Okay, so let me see. You agree. And then the download takes place. Oh, okay. You're using Ubuntu? Yeah, so for Ubuntu, you would use the i386, this one, for the 32-bit. And then if you're using, I don't think, oh yeah, if you're using, yeah, because the other ones are for other OSs. Okay, so I have my Ubuntu machine here. Yeah, I'm also using version. Let me see. Let me test it, okay? So we are going to go to tenable.com. And then let me see if I can find. Sorry, 1 second. Go to downloads extension here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and download the 32-bit. We're going to go ahead and save file. Okay, so after that, then you can, okay, so let's do this. Then you have to fill out your email information. So, all right, here is where you would need to fill it out, right? If we can use the essential, which is going to be the version that's free, we would register and then fill out our information there, and it's going to email you or it's going to give you the activation code. Okay. Then, okay, 1 second. Let me fill out my information and then I'll see what's happening with yours. Yeah, it should let you download unless you have something blocking it. Check your Wi-Fi, maybe if you're whitelisting things on the Wi-Fi, maybe it's not letting you download. Or let me fill this out so I can get the activation code. Okay. Okay, so Michelle, if you are, okay, so give me a warning, Firefox Ubuntu I use. Oh, okay, so you have to install it first. And then after that you would, so after you download, did you install it on Ubuntu? And then you can use the URL. It's always going to say that because the firewall that's in Ubuntu, it's going to notify you that it's not a safe URL. Okay, so make sure that you install it first. So let me get the I will share screen as soon as I can get access to my email here. So I downloaded mine on my Ubuntu. Okay. Switch again. So it gave me the activation code. And then I'm going to go to download. Hold on 1 second. Trying to see. Give me 1 second, okay? Let me take a look at there. Okay, so let me put this in the chat for y'all. If you're using, this is their documentation on how to install it. Okay. You should be able to use your web browser, and then you have to allow it. Okay. All right. So Michelle, here, let me go to share screen. So one of the things why it's giving you that notification is because this. Okay. It requires a self-signed SSL certificate. So that means that it's going to try to use SSL to make sure that that certificate is available. So you are getting that security warning because it's looking for this. Okay. Then if you go here, it shows you that if you're using Firefox, you would select I understand the risk, and then you are going to select add exception. Okay. Then you are going to do the get certificate, and you're going to confirm the security exception. That's what you have to do to bypass it. You can also do it in command prompt or command line as part of the book. That's what it shows you, how you can bypass it. Okay, so if you or other people are using the Debian Linux, and when you're trying to run it on the web browser with that IP address, and if it's telling you the security warning, right, you have to select I understand the risk, then you click on add exception, and then you're going to click on get certificate, and then confirm security exception. Then it's going to allow you to have the trusted site, because it doesn't have the trust. It doesn't have the certificate to establish the trust yet. So it's going to see it as unsafe. Okay. So I'll put the link for the security warning if you want to go directly to that. And that's through Tenable documentation. Okay. Any question? So to access the graphical user interface, you can use, the the server IP address, the local host, or we can simply put in the loopback address with the port number. Now, if you're running antivirus software, and here it talks about virtual machines, right? Because it's using NAT. It doesn't have much of an effect. Let me see. So to install Nessus, it also tells you how to install Nessus if you click on that. And then for the Linux, if you're using Debian like Kali or that, you can simply use this. Okay. So I'll go ahead and, so I downloaded mine, then I can go to the terminal. And then I simply activate the package, so let me see if I can zoom in. So, and then it's going to be Nessus with an option. So the version number we downloaded is on the file. So let's come back here, 10.1.2. AMT64 DB. Oh. I gotta get got to get to the and then after you have installed the package, you can simply use the Nessus SD. Okay. All right. So let's come back to the assignment real quick so we can answer that question before we moved on. And if you want to download it, you can. So Nessus is a vulnerability scanner. We touch on that. The application can be downloaded and installed on the system to scan the host on the network using web interface via the browser. And we just simply put in the server IP address or the IP address of the system that's running the Nessus application. With the port by default, it uses the port 884. Okay. So for the lab, I will write down all the lists or the procedure for you to be able to run that on Linux. And then we are going to use nessrest to be able to build out the Python script that will work with the Nessus API. Okay, so as you look at Nessus, right, in the text, after you install, you can go into this directory and be able to start it. Then after that, to really interface with it, we talked about how we can use loopback IP or that actual system IP address with the port number 8834. So the interface, you will see that it's going to be through the browser. And note that it is self-signing certificate. So I put in the link for you to look at the security warnings. You have to accept the security risk in order for it to override the SSL requirement. That means that once you accept that, because it's not a trusted site, right? For your local system, then it's going to allow you to have a self-signing certificate in order to connect as you are connecting to yourself. Okay. So if you scan your particular network, it might come up with multiple systems, but in the case that we're our virtual machine, that's going to be us. So it's going to give you something like this. Okay, it might not be DNS, but it just show localhost under DNS. Unless you run your system with the DNS service. Now to create scan on the graphical user interface, you simply click My Scan tab. Okay. And then you would select your target. And then it's going to give you a template set like this. So we can start with the discovery, or if you select the basic network scan, which is under vulnerability, it's going to look for the vulnerability for each of the hosts. Okay, so initially Nessus is always going to try to find all the existing system around it, and it does that through ping. Then it's going to look at we can look at all the vulnerability for those systems. Now, advanced scan is going to allow you to configure more. And so you can select various templates for your system. Now, it also does malware scan and other things. So if you're running web application testing, you can also select that particular template. So they have pre-made templates for you to use. Often we can start with the network scan that is basic. So that is going to give you any host assessment for the vulnerability. Okay. So once you have completed your scan, it's going to give you a report, which you can export it to PDF, CSV, and also you can have it in the HTML version because the interface is web. So after you scan it, if it found vulnerability, it's going to give you the count on the tab. And it's going to list the name of your vulnerability along with the plugins that it used for assessment. Then the number of times that vulnerability comes up in the scan, it's going to show you the count. And then from that list, we can determine the severity level. Now, if you want to look at the specific vulnerability, then you click on it and it's going to give you the detail. So here it talks about the reporting and it gives you the vulnerability critical level right here. So if it's high, right? So here we can see that based on this particular screen capture, you just see that we would have generally information and some medium vulnerability. Okay. And the button really also show you that. So it color codes it for you. So the Nessus version that I've used in the past was a lot less than this. And I think they have improved it much more over time. Okay. So if you look at specific vulnerability, it will look something like this. And you can export that out for reporting purposes. Okay. Like if you wanted to make it the CSV format, you can do so. So with that, we can address the next question, which is number 4. So you would need to describe the content of the scan report. How should this report be used to reduce system vulnerabilities? So it would contain information like your host vulnerability, the plugins of the vulnerability, the frequency of the vulnerability, and severity level. So those are the things that you're going to look for. How often it's found, what kind of plugins that's connected to the vulnerability, because that's where the vulnerability inherent weakness would be, and then the severity level. From the report, we can identify the information about the vulnerability and the score, the base score of that, which tells us how severe it is. And for most cases, you would need to further research that. You can go to Mitre, you can go to national database to really read up on that vulnerability. And as you put this into your risk assessment report or security report, right, as a pen tester or as a security analyst, you would need to list all the found vulnerabilities so that report can be extracted by exporting. And so you can put that into your regular report, the write-up for your analysis. And using the CSV, it's also important because we can then use it to visualize the data and graph out some information, especially for the critical vulnerability that frequently occurs. Okay, so for number 4, in general, the report is useful for us because we want to see how frequent it is, what kind of plugin is used, which host has the vulnerability, and how severe is it. Okay, and then from there, we'll be able to find additional information and additional solutions to be able to reduce, right, or omit that vulnerability. Some cases you can remove the vulnerability, but in most cases, right, because of that service in existence and there's no fix for it, then we would need to accept that vulnerability for, you know, a certain application or a certain service. Any question with this? Okay, so for the next part, it goes into how you can implement Python module with Nessus. And we've been working with quite a few APIs. And in the past, we talked about how we can implement RESTful framework for any kind of API. So the Python module that you're using to set up your script for Nessus API is called nessrest. This is a way that we can write Python script to interface with the system or the Nessus server that's going to run the scan. That means that we can automate the scans or we can set up the scans through our script. So the easiest way to really access the server is through using the browser, right? Firefox is equipped with Debian Linux. So we can put in the IP address support number. And if you do the /API with the hashtag, that will allow you to access the API extension for that particular page. And to read more on their repository and tutorials and things like that, you can go to the GitHub. Now in Linux, because of the dependencies, you would see that there are some requirements. So if you go to this particular GitHub, you would find, let me see if I can click. this and I can show you. So if you go to this GitHub, you would find the requirement.txt and you can download it, and you can do that on your virtual machine. So that way you can use that text file to do the installation setup. Okay. And then there are some requirements. So with nessrest, you have to make sure that you fulfill the requirement steps. So how, so when you look at this information here, when you do the pip install our requirement.txt, make sure you download the requirement.txt first. And that's through the GitHub repository for Tenable nessrest. Then after that, in your command line, you would then use Python 3 to run the setup install, which allows you to go through the setup process. To interact with the server, you can use the shell, where you would need to first import in the module. Then from there, you would need to import in the class from that module, which is nessrest. And then if you want to know more on how to use that class, you would use the help method. Okay. But ultimately, if you don't want to use the help method after you import the class, you need to disable the SSL, just like how you did on the browser. Okay. So what you can do is you can set up an object or a constructor, right? You would construct an object, and we would use this, and it's an object of the scanner class under nessrest, nessrest superclass. Then for your server here, we just got to make sure that we modify that to make sure that it's localhost or our IP address or the loopback address, right? And then whatever your login name would be and your password. And lastly, this is to handle the SSL certificate. So all that is kind of like how we would accept the risk on our browser. So you would say insecure is true. So after you construct the object, what you will do is you would then use scan add method to be able to scan, to begin your scan. And so all of this can be done through Python shell, right? Or you can write it into a script and then run that script through command line, like call on Python and then just execute that particular Py file or module. So there are two ways that we can do this. So first, we need to make sure that we do a scan add, right? And you can scan a certain target by putting in the actual IP address there. Then you can run that scan. So when we do a scan add, all that is you configure that scan. And when you do the scan run method, that's when you activate and run that scan. Now, it also comes with other methods like scan list, scan result, and scan details. So just like how after we scan, we would have a list of our vulnerabilities. So you can use your scan list method to list the details in your scan. So it gives you the scan list information on that server. Scan result is going to give you the actual result. And also, if you want to get details on a certain scan, you can do scan details. So those are the built-in methods for this particular module, and you can use that in shell, or you can write it within the script and run it. Okay. Any question? So coming back here, we can answer number 5. Explain how Nessus module can be used in Python programming to create vulnerability scan. How do you install this module in Debian Linux? Okay. So just like any of the other module, we can use the pip3 because it's for Python 3. So nessrest module can be used to interface with Nessus API to automate scans or create scan. We don't have to automate multiple scans, but we can create the scan. And keep in mind that we talked about how even when we automate scans, sometimes it would see something as false positive. So to install, we need to first do the dependencies, and we would need to download. So I need to put that in here for you. So visit GitHub repo and download requirement.txt file first. Then after we download the requirement.txt, then we can install all the requirements based on what's listed in that file. And then we would install the module by doing the sudo python 3 setup.py install. So it's going to go through and do the installation. Now, if we are using the browser, then you can use the IP address or the loopback address or localhost there, and make sure that we use port 8834. With the API, you have to put in the extension to that URL. So you would have API hashtag, and you can look at the overview where it gives you the summary. But if we want to scan, then we would put in resources scan, and we can provide the list. So doing that through HTML is able to generate the list of your scan. Or if we just run the scan only, it will provide this general scan list information. Okay. So there are multiple ways that you can interact with Nessus. One way is through using the module or Nessus API, I should say, nessrest. Another way is to use the browser itself and put in the appropriate URL, right, with the page extension to be able to use scan or see scan or obtain results and so on. Any question? So we would do more, the procedure in our lab this week, right? And then we would be able to run our scan. So for this, now, if you're using the module, of course, you can use the built-in method like what we talked about. I also put down an example. In this example, simply use the local machine as your Nessus server, and then to be able to get the scan list. So what we showed there for number 6, that will be equivalent to your example 1, right? If you write that in Python. So let's take a look at that. So now you can, because your nessrest is already been installed, you can import in the actual class, or you can say from nessrest import ness6rest, which is the super class. And then we also need to use argparse on this one. So this is where we would import in another module. Here, you set up a variable that's going to be for the URL. And we need to parse the argument. And we need to have login and password. So here, that's where we would use the parser section that comes from this module, because it's going to authenticate the user in order to allow the scan. Then after that, we would construct an object called scan. And this is a ness6rest object. Okay. So it's going to plug in the URL. So if you don't define a variable here, what you can do is you need to specify that here. And then we need to tell it to log in. So this two are going to be that. And then this is going to bypass the SSL requirement. Then after that, we are going to call on the scan list method. And we want to display it. So we have to do a print. So when you do it in shell, you simply do the object and then scan list method, but you don't have to issue the print. But if you run the Python file in command line through Python 3, then you still have to call on the print method. So in here, we nested in the scan list inside the print method so we can display the text. And then down here, we declare another object or container where it's going to be storing the list of scans. So it's going to give you a list of all the scans from that server. And in order to display the content of that list, we have to implement a for loop to be able to access the details, which gives you the name of the list and the timestamp. I mean, the name of the scan and the timestamp. So when do we need to really use this is when you can take a look at, historically, what has been scanned on that server, how often it is, because in compliance, not only that you have to assess your system, you have to assess your system in certain frequency, like twice a year, once a year for certain regulation requirement. So doing this will allow us to see, right, how many scans has been done to really identify the vulnerability and what kind of scan it is on that server. So this script would be equivalent to what you see in the previous section where it talks about this, right? The way you would do everything in shell, in Python shell. Okay. So simply in Python shell, we just go line by line compared to if we're running a script, right? It's the interpreter is still going to go line by line, right? Like this. But as it runs the program, it's going to be able to display the result that you would need, right? In your IDE, or typically if you're using Linux, you would go through command line anyway. Now, or we can go and use the browser to access the API by doing this. So if you want scan list, you just use this URL on the browser, right? Which is the simplest way instead of running multiple commands in order to get there. Okay, any question? All right, then what you would have next is, let's see. Okay. Any question regarding 5 and 6 or the content of the note for Nessus? Okay, so next we are going to talk about another example. So similar to example 1, in example 2, we are going to also access the local host as it is the Nessus server. We're also going to obtain the scan list or display it. And in this one, it is slightly different in that you are going to use the Nessus client class. Okay. And you are going to parse everything in JSON. So the output of this is going to be a little bit different than what you've seen with example 1. So first we have request module, import that in, because remember that this is web application. So you have the web interface in the application. So this is why we're using requests. Since we're parsing things to JSON, we need to import in JSON. And also, just like the other one, we have to do our parse, which allows us to authenticate along with controlling how the pieces that would manage Nessus come through. in the script. And for this one, we use the Nessus client. We create a class. We define this class with its member, right? We say what the server is, what port is, and we will plug that in. So if you don't define those there, you can simply, have the self.url, and then you would type out, your server information, which is your IP address, and then your port information. And this allows us to parse it into the actual method. And since we're using request module, we would be able to implement, header information as it would be HTML. So here we have a function called getRequest, and then we'll plug in the URL, the data, the headers, and with the verification for our certificate, we would say false there. And we want to return our content as JSON. So we would then return, right, with the response of your content in JSON. So it needs to first get the request, then it's going to post the request. Remember that this script is working with the HTTP element of that application. Compared to the last script, it would work directly with the API, not through HTTP. So this is why you would have a get and a post. And similar to the get, we would have the URL, and then we would also load in JSON. And then we have additional method here. So here's another function where this is going to be how it's going to communicate with the API, where it would pass the credential token and the cookies. So this is where for how it's going to bring the API across. Then it's going to be logging in. So we have to write a separate function for that. So when you are not using the nessrest module, as you can see, if we're using request module and operate it through HTTP, your script is it's more lengthy, as you have to address every element for that application API through HTML and HTTP. Okay. And so in example 2, you see it's slightly different, as it would be not using nessrest. And just like before, right, we want to parse in information because everything comes through in string. So we want to parse it so that way it would convert it and log it. So that way it can log you in after the conversion from string to your low-level data. Okay. Now from the client side, we declare a client, which is itself the local machine. We would make sure that that user is logged in for the client and for the scan. So we create an object for scan. And as we need to access and print out the vulnerability, you would implement a nested for loop. First, it needs to look at your client request. Then it would access every index in that list for your list of vulnerability from the client and be able to output that in text using print method. Okay. So these are the steps on how you would write a Python script that would not use nessrest, but it uses requests on the HTTP side in order to obtain a scan list from the Nessus server as the client. Question. Okay. I see a chat. Do you have to start Nessus to run the script or just enter Yeah, so you should start Nessus, and to start Nessus, you can go to, I think it's on page. You have to start it because it's located in the etc directory. You would do this. So that would start the, yep, no problem. It would start the server. Then you can, yeah, I wrote down the step here. Then you can go and you open up your browser and use the IP address. Okay. Any other question regarding Nessus? So as you look through, right, it talks about how you can run scans in various ways, or there are multiple ways that we can write the script to get our scan list information. Now, another vulnerability scanner is known as the OpenVAS, and it stands for Open Vulnerability Assessment System. This is an open source vulnerability scanner, and it also has management capability. So slightly different than Nessus. Nessus is a vulnerability scanner, and it does have some element of management. This allows you to not only identify the vulnerability with the appropriate severity and the details, it also allows you to manage it through, that's a mechanism that they had built into this particular tool. So if you click on this link, it will take you to the product information. Okay. And then if you go to documentation here, it would take you to this page, and you can download the manual accordingly based on what kind of versions that you would have. Okay. And this is for Greenbone, which is a dashboard that you would see for OpenVAS. So for 7, we can say that the purpose of OpenVAS is for vulnerability scanning and management. To install, and I think there's a discrepancy in how we can install OpenVAS in the textbook, because I tested, but I did write down like how it is written in the textbook. So the installation, very similar to Nessus, you can go to the site and then you can download. But if you don't have OpenVAS, or if you try to do it through command line with sudo apt-get install OpenVAS, you might come across an error. Okay. And then after you have downloaded and installed OpenVAS in command line, you would open it to do the setup by doing sudo OpenVAS setup. Okay. So for now, we would just go with the book answer, but there are additional steps that you would need for OpenVAS to be installed in your Debian Linux OS. Questions? Okay, so here it talks about how we can install and do the setup. So during the configuration, this application, it will also give you what it's called the NVTs. It is network vulnerability tests. And this test includes the signature of the vulnerability, like what you've seen in Nessus plugins. Okay. And in order for it to run and to assess your vulnerability, it needs to run many of these signatures, or what we call the NVTs. So to start OpenVAS scanner, you would do OpenVAS-start after you install it. And then you would need to make sure that you check for your service. So to run the service for the scanner, you simply do systemctl. Okay. Or if you want to run the manager, you would do systemctl status OpenVAS-scanner manager. And then for the assistant for Greenbone service, so these are the services that you can run after your OpenVAS has started. It's kind of like clicking on certain feature on the interface or the graphical user interface. Okay, so we can start the service, we can access the manager, and we can also use the Greenbone Security Assistant. So in the application, there are three primary services. One, it's used for scanning, and that's just to analyze vulnerability. That's what it's designed to do. Two, it can be used to manage vulnerability. So the manager service allows you to filter, classify, control the configuration of your vulnerability assessment using OpenVAS. Third, for the client service, this is a way that we can use the GUI to configure our scan and present the results. So if you want a result to be presented a certain way, client service allows you to do that. Okay. So in the next question here, it asks you to describe the type of services for OpenVAS. So we know that we have scanning service to scan for vulnerability, manager service to manage task output, controlling database, and user functionality and group roles. So if you have, let's say, multiple people using OpenVAS this way, you can actually set up groups and user and then control the privilege access to the application through the manager service. Any question regarding OpenVAS? All right. So the services, you can find that on page 7. Okay. And this set of notes is a little longer in that because there's a lot of screenshot. Okay. So very similar to Nessus, your web interface is going to run using your system IP address. And in our case, we're using ourselves, our virtual machine, our system, Linux system. So you can do the localhost. But the port number is 9392 for OpenVAS. Okay, so different port number compared to Nessus. And it would look like this. So if you're using the web browser, or the graphical user interface, you would then log in as administrator with an account. And then you would then see the dashboard where you can run and configure your security scan. So the dashboard is customizable. It's allowing you to see, right, your vulnerability, manage your vulnerability, look at a certain group of hosts or all hosts. And statistically, it also provides you, or visually, it's providing you graphs and details about your vulnerability ranking. In your scan management, we talked about how it would be for tasks or how we can modify an existing scan that's been done in the past. And then there are features for us to access the list of hosts. So if you do assessment management, you would, because very similar to Nessus, we can set up for a group of hosts, right? Or all hosts. So here, assessment management allows you to configure that. Secondfo is simply associated with CVE's ID. And the ID will contain CVE dash year number and then the unique ID. And so that's just describing to you some element of the management capability. Okay. So if I want to make a new scan, I just create a target. So I need to specify what IP address that is. Then I would create a task. And then I can schedule the task to run. Now, we can also configure the quality of detection to show more or less of the detail regarding the threats. So here it talks about min qualification or quality detection. This allows you to configure the system to gather, right, vulnerability that could be related to real threats. So that means that it has to discover a certain set of systems or a system. We can use a quick way to scan is to use full and fast, or if you're using full and very deep, that's just going to be more details on your scan. So these are some of the things that you can modify or look into on OpenVAS. So as we get the vulnerability information, you are going to get the specific details on that will be displayed. And it also contains a database which is from the library that's incorporated for the program files and specific problems. Now, not all of the problems can be corrected or mitigate, right? We would only be limited to what is in that database. So on the Python side, right, how can you implement this? You are going to use Python-GMV module. And the documentation is here. So when you go to their documentation, if you click on tutorial, right, it leads you through here. So it talks about how you can get started, where would you go after you did the installation. Okay. Any question? Okay, so I included example 3 and 4 for you to look at. Example 3 is very short, and in the chapter we don't have too many examples. So when we take a look at this script, we know that we are importing in GVM. That's for OpenVAS, and we are also going to import in the sub element of GVM, where it would be using the module. Okay, so next we have an object called connection, and in this connection it's going to use TLS connection method. or I'm sorry, class. And then we can specify the host name instead of an IP. And so example 3 simply give you the version, okay? Compared to example 4 gives you the information of your vulnerability. So let me put that in here. So here's example. So similar to the other one, and this one, we're only going to import in the elements of GVM and that package or module, that package. Then we are going to establish connection, very similar to the other one. And we also want to put in the username and password because it requires authentication. And so when you see a lot of the web-based application like this one or Nessus, you're always going to have some form of authentication. Then we are going to use, right, various methods. So get user, get target, get scanners, get configs, that comes from the GVM module. So here, this section allows us to print or display more details. Okay, so example 4 is definitely a little longer. So what I like for you to do too is you can test some of this script on your system after you install it successfully. And then we would re-practice when we do the lab on Wednesday. And also example 4, use try an exception. So it does do exception handling in the case where if we cannot connect to the server, which is here. Okay. So for number 9, you can refer to example 3 and 4. You need to write a Python script that would provide the details and the information. Okay. See how you can take a look at the templated example that's provided and be able to elevate it. Okay, and then we'll explore a little further when we get to this on Wednesday. Any question? Okay, so the last part of the notes contain the example. And I wanted to use this way so you can obtain it and be able to test it by copy and pasting. Okay, any question? Question? So fairly short chapter. I will, release the project next week, as I told you before spring break, that we will address the project in week 10. That's going to give you 6 weeks to be able to work on the project. It will be, you'll be required to implement scanning for, different types of servers. And then what we're using different tools for API. So you would have an option to implement your tools appropriately. As you go through these chapters, you will see that we have various options, right? So I'll provide the rubric information, the project information that will be available next week. Okay. And then we also have a quiz and extra credit next week as well. Okay, any other questions, concern, things like that? Let me pause or stop the recording.